Hello, this is Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy in Washington, D.C. on a very rainy afternoon with the pleasure of talking with the author of a new book on Abraham Lincoln and his times. The author is Joshua Zeitz, if I'm saying your name correctly, hopefully.
That's exactly right.
And he is a contributing writer to Politico and has been published in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, in the Atlantic, among many other publications. His new book is called Lincoln's God, How Faith Transformed a President and a Nation. Let me hold it up. And the book is not simply about President Lincoln's personal faith, but how religion affected the politics and culture of America before and during the Civil War, affecting the course of events. So Josh, thanks so much for writing this book. Obviously, there have been many, many books written about Lincoln's personal faith, coming to very different conclusions. What is unique about your book?
I think what I tried to do, and it's a little different from what others tried to do, is I tried to place Lincoln's spiritual journey in the larger context of America's spiritual journey in the first half of the 19th century and then through the Civil War. I mean, Lincoln is a bit of an iconoclast in many walks of life, but he has this unique journey from skeptic to believer. At the same time that the country itself is really wrapped up in the Second Great Awakening, in a tremendous spirit of religious revivalism. And I tried to sort of use these two stories in parallel to explain why Lincoln, has a personal, I wouldn't call it a conversion experience per se, but why he has this particular journey that takes him from skeptic to believer, but also show how it was operating, apart from the broader religious culture. This was a country that was steeped in evangelical Protestantism. It was the lens through which most Northerners understood and made sense of the war. Christianity became a lens through which Lincoln also made sense of the war, but he never really came to the same set of beliefs and faith that most of his countrymen did, even as he learned to speak the language of evangelical Christianity and mobilize the evangelical community. So I'm trying to look at these stories in parallel and explain how they fit together, and also use that as a way to point out what is unique about Lincoln's religious journey.
So Lincoln was literally born during the Second Great Awakening in Kentucky, which was in many ways the heart of the Second Great Awakening. So obviously he grew up amidst a very frenzied form of Christianity, but was not always conventional in his own religious beliefs throughout his life. Outline a little bit the shape and form of his personal religion across his 56 some years.
Sure. So Lincoln's born in Kentucky and then grew up in Indiana. And his parents, both his parents and then his father and his stepmother, were hardshell Baptist or anti-mission Baptist. So they were in many ways themselves a bit set aside from the larger wave of evangelical revivalism. Hardshell Baptists were much more, they were effectively old school Calvinists. And so different from, let's say, the non-hardshell Baptists, Presbyterians, Methodists during this period, disciples of Christ. The evangelical movement really emphasizes, it's broad, it's diverse, but it emphasizes personal agency, the ability to accept Christ and become a Christian and secure your salvation. Whereas I think the religion that he grew up in, the religious sensibility he grew up in with his parents, was much more traditionally predestinarian in its faith. He rejected that wholesale. And as a young man, and a young man on the make in New Salem, Illinois, was not only not a hardshell Baptist, he also didn't gravitate to the sort of broader center of evangelical consensus. He was a scoffer. His friends knew him and remembered him after the fact as irreligious, as somebody who openly questioned the divinity of Christ or even the existence of God. And this was a problem for him in his first several campaigns for public office and his first campaigns for the state legislature. And then later in 1846, when he ran for Congress for his one and only term in the House of Representatives, ironically, his opponent was a very famous Methodist circuit rider named Peter Cartwright, whose campaign openly referenced, Lincoln's alleged irreligiosity. And so over the years, Lincoln learned to sort of bite his tongue and be a little more shut-mouthed about his position on religion, which was effectively nothing at all. As late as 1858, according to a close friend, the local Presbyterian minister in Springfield, with whom the Lincolns were very friendly on a social basis, attempted to convert him and couldn't do it. So by all accounts, in 1861, early 1861, when he leaves Springfield for Washington, he's still not a religious man. It's only during the war that he develops a sense of spirituality. And, there are different root causes of it, but we know, it's very difficult it's difficult to access Abraham Lincoln's internal kind of world, because he's a person who did not leave a large written record, non-public record. So we don't have a lot of personal letters. We don't have a lot of personal recollections of his or reminiscences of his. We have to rely on his public statements and on what people remembered that he said or did. And those memories, could be really inaccurate years after the fact, or they could come with an agenda. But by all accounts, if you look at, the scant personal papers that he left behind during the Civil War period, if you look at the sort of consensus around what people remembered, his actions and words as having been, and if you look at the shift in tone of his public statements and speeches and letters, it's very clear that something happened. And the book looks at a number of different potential reasons for this, but certainly by 1863, this is somebody who, has moved well beyond his former state of irreligiosity and clearly believes in some form of divinity.
So when Lincoln is elected in 1860, according to some historical surveys, overall church attendance and membership in America was actually lower than it is today. So was Lincoln more religious than most Americans by the time he was president, or is he about where most Americans were in 1860?
No, I think, the numbers I looked at in the book, and it's hard to look at what church attendance and membership would have been in these days, but this was relative to any period before this in American history, Americans were more religious, more church going, and more Christian, more Protestant, and more evangelical than any period before. If you look at this is one seemingly bizarre statistic, but there were as many Methodist clergymen on the eve of the Civil War as there were postmasters or postal employees in the US. And this is an important statistic, mainly because in this period, the Postal Service was the largest and most influential branch of the United States government, the federal government. It was the branch that people came into direct day-to-day contact with more than any other before the Civil War. Obviously, during the war, the federal government grows. So we know by church attendance, by the volume of tract societies and their output, and Bible societies and their output, and evangelical reform organizations, and just by the sheer number of clergymen, certainly by standards of 1860, say versus 1820, it was a much more religious country than it had been, and certainly that comparison holds true if you look at the period just after the Revolution, when really there was a sort of an ebb in religiosity. Now, compared with today, would be a tough comparison to make, but I would argue that he was an outlier in that, there were church members, there were people who were not formal members of churches, but who attended churches. There were people who didn't attend churches. He was on the outer edge of sort of non-participation. He and his wife rented a pew at the Presbyterian Church in Springfield, but this was done more out of deference to her than, he certainly didn't attend on any regular basis.
And is it fair to say that believing Protestants form basically the core of the anti-slavery movement and the core of the new Republican Party?
Yeah, I think, this is a complicated point I try to address in the book. The heart of the anti-slavery movement and the heart of the abolitionist movement, these are not the same thing, but there is obviously a sort of overlapping circle. The heart of those movements are evangelical Protestantism. It was evangelical Christians who brought their faith to bear in the anti-slavery movement, and then later as organizers of the anti-slavery Republican Party. The entire movement was suffused with a religious enthusiasm, and it was so salient a debate among the evangelical churches that it eventually, in the 1830s and 40s, formed a break within the Presbyterian, Baptist, and Methodist churches between the North and the South. That having been said, two things can be true at the same time. evangelical Protestantism was the beating heart of the anti-slavery movement, but most evangelical Protestants on the eve of the war were probably not anti-slavery, and they certainly were not abolitionists. So it's a tension that plays out over a number of years.
So even if he was not personally devout, Lincoln, because of his background, certainly understood and spoke the language of devout Protestants.
That's true, and that became more true during the war. I mean, his opposition to slavery in the 1850s, and he was a man on fire on this issue. I mean, he was fascinating that he was what we would today call a single issue, a politician. He had essentially dropped out of politics after he came back from Congress in 1848, and he's awakened by the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the controversy around it in 1854. He's just on fire about slavery, and it becomes his all-consuming issue for the next 6 years. But he frames his opposition in the 1850s to slavery in a very secular way. This is very much to him about the right of individuals to enjoy the fruits of their own labor, to eat the bread that they earn with their own sweat, to be treated with a modicum of civic equality, at least equality before the law. But during the 1860s, during the war, the way in which he speaks about the war and its meaning and slavery becomes entirely more religious, and he begins to draw, in very direct ways on the King James Bible and the language of the King James Bible. And that's important in that, he was a close student of the Bible, the King James Bible, and of Shakespeare. And if Shakespeare and the King James Bible, at least the translation in common use in the 1860s, sounded alike, it's because they were both, products of Elizabethan England with a very similar English vernacular, cometh, doth, knoweth, the sort of th endings on words. But he suffuses his speeches, including the Gettysburg Address, with religious imagery and argot that would have been really familiar to religious people, and particularly Protestants. When we talk about a new birth of freedom in the Gettysburg Address, I think most historians will tell you that's obviously a signal to the country that the war has shifted from a war for union, as it was, to a war for a union without slavery. It's a new birth of freedom, but a new birth of freedom was also a knowing reference to the popular notion of rebirth and regeneration. And so that type of language was recognizable to most Americans who were active in Protestant churches. And it's a language that he used increasingly after he became president, but not at all before.
And so he becomes more devout under the pressure of the suffering of the war and the personal loss of his second son. Are there other influences pushing him in that direction?
Yeah, there are a few things, right? I mean, he, like many Americans, experienced his death in a really personal way during the war. He didn't lose a son in the war, but he lost his son Willie to typhoid in early 1862, and it was devastating to him and to his wife. And it was a sense of personal loss that she later said really caused him to rethink his religiosity and his and what he felt about the universe, in effect. I think it's the weight of knowing that he is overseeing this carnival of death. He comes by the end of the war to believe that he's personally an instrument of God, and that it's his role, that he's been chosen to prosecute this war to whatever end it meets. Although unlike most Protestants, and it's very interesting, he's not at all convinced that God has willed that the Union win the war. If you look at sermons and church publications and the speeches of lay and religious leaders in this period, they're firmly of the conviction that God's on the Union side and the Union is on God's side. Lincoln comes to believe he's an instrument of God and that it's his role to fight an abolition war to its end, but he's not entirely convinced that God has willed that the Union win that war. He believes that the war is divine punishment for slavery that's got to be visited upon Northerners and Southerners alike, because both sections have been complicit in its perpetuation. But I think it's Willie's death. It's trying to make sense of his own role in this war that's going to eventually take 750,000 people lives, and it's him trying to grapple with what it is that he was meant to do here, and what his responsibility ultimately was. So these things, really cause him, I think, to reevaluate his spirituality, but he does so in a way that's really distinct from how even as he is really he's mobilizing the Protestant community. He's speaking the language of evangelical Protestantism, and he's helping Americans to frame abolition and war through a religious context. His personal religious journey is still very different from the mainstream Protestantism.
And his views on race, his personal dealings with Black people, he seems to have almost, certainly by the standards of his day, an almost egalitarian view regarding race. Is that shaped by his emerging religious faith?
I don't know that it is. I think that he, but by contemporary standards today, we would look at Abraham Lincoln and say, well, he's a bit of a racist, right? He believes in the civil and economical equality of Black people and white people. He firmly believes that you can't hold a human being in bondage, and he firmly believes that people should be able to enjoy the fruits of their own labor and enjoy the freedom of movement and speech, and the things that are laid down in the Constitution. And he's very clear about that in the 1850s, but he's also very clear in the 1850s that he doesn't believe in what would then have been called the social equality between the races. So things like integrated public facilities, which doesn't even really become an issue until the late 1860s and 1870s, or voting rights. He doesn't even embrace the idea of voting rights for African Americans, for freedmen, until the very end of the war, and then only for a certain portion of Black persons who would meet certain property or literacy qualifications. So he wouldn't qualify by today's standards as being an egalitarian, but by contemporary standards in his own time, right? He certainly believed strongly in civic and economic equality, and it's very clear during the war that his opposition to slavery takes on a much more I don't want to say moral affront, because I think he believed it was a moral affront to deny people the fruits of their own labor or fundamental civil rights. But it's very clear during the war, and just his invocation of Old Testament themes and themes that and language from Exodus, that there's something about the offense of slavery that he believes offends God, and that is not a way he would have framed it in the 1850s. So I don't know, from a policy perspective, that it moved him too far, but it's very clear that the offense he takes at slavery takes on a more religious frame as the war goes on.
Was the religious faith of the time key to the patience and zeal that Northern public opinion had for prosecuting the war?
I think that it was, and I think it wasn't just the faith itself, but also the active engagement of the churches. The mainline evangelical churches during the war really operated, they came to operate over the course of those 4.5 years as really kind of adjuncts to the state. This particularly played itself out in areas where there was a Republican majority, but even in the lower Midwest, you saw intense backlash by sort of a minority of Democrats who were anti-war to the politicization of their churches and the ways in which their so-called war pastors spoke politics from the pulpit. But that what that tells us is that this was happening a lot, and that a majority of evangelical clergymen were throwing their weight behind the war. This is true also of church publications, of lay people and lay leaders in the churches. There were organizations like the Sanitary Commission and the Christian Commission, which were effectively church-run, state-sanctioned organizations that helped minister to the physical and spiritual needs of soldiers in the field. Churches served as recruiting stations. American flags hung high at most Methodist churches during the war. Prominent pastors eventually in 1864 took to the hustings for the Republican Party. So I think the Lincoln and others were really savvy about being able to help use religion as a way for people to make sense of what their role in this was. But the churches themselves also embraced a kind of muscular form of Christianity and political Christianity that would have been really out of place before the war, when the focus had been really on kind of filling pews and winning souls. And even to the extent that the evangelical reform movements in the mid-19th century were trying to enforce social change, they were doing it by trying to convince sinners not to sin. So whether you were a slaveholder, or whether you were a drunkard, or somebody who enjoyed liquor a little too much, the focus wasn't on criminalizing slavery or criminalizing alcohol. It was on convincing the sinner to lead a different kind of life. But the churches became really much more comfortable during the war in participating in politics, because they came to believe that that the war was a holy war, that it was a ordained war by God, and that they had a role in helping to build and sustain support for it. So it creates a very interesting shift in the way that Protestantism functions that I think carries on through the late 19th century in different ways.
And when he gives his famous second inaugural address, declaring that the war had been a divine judgment on the nation for slavery, was that was more than just rhetoric that people would understand. That was something he sincerely believed.
That absolutely. Frederick Douglass said that he was sort of perplexed after he was there for the second inaugural, and reflected that it sounded more like a sermon than a state document. And it's a remarkable, it was a remarkable speech. It was I think it's the second shortest inaugural address still. The only shorter one was Franklin Roosevelt's fourth inaugural address in 1945, when he was, not physically well and able to deliver a longer address. And Lincoln later said he thought it was the best thing he'd ever delivered, but that it probably would take some time before it caught hold. And it is a remarkably religious document. It's probably the most singularly religious inaugural address that any president has ever delivered. And he does two things. He makes very clear that the war was punishment for the whole nation for slavery, but he also makes clear that I think his belief that you can't really divine God's will, and that's where he believed that the war was punishment for slavery, but it was very clear that he also believed that both sides might very well continue to suffer that punishment for some time to come. There was no certainty that the Union was simply going to win the war, even though by that point in time it was looking like they might. And that's a sort of interesting component here, because one of the things that helped so many evangelical Christians during the war believe in the certitude that they were on God's side, God was on the Union side, was I think that part of the evangelical faith was this belief in a very personal relationship with Christ. Lincoln comes to a form of religiosity that, but it ironically resembles his father's religion, the father who he spent an entire life trying to get away from, than it does mainstream evangelical Protestantism. His God is way more unknowable and distant, and his personal agency, Lincoln's personal agency in this scheme, is limited. God's got a role for him, but he doesn't know what it is, and he probably won't ever know what it is. So that second inaugural appealed to the sort of the religious sensibility of millions of Northern voters, but at the same time it betrayed his personal struggle to sort of divine what he thought he'd never be able to divine, which was what the outcome of this was supposed to be.
And then finally, of course, he's assassinated on Good Friday, essentially becoming sort of the martyred Christ of American democracy. It's almost an appropriate conclusion to his religious trajectory.
That's exactly right. It was the outpouring of grief nationwide after his assassination, or at least through the North, was intense. And the fact that he was martyred on Good Friday and died following day, the first time that most people congregated together in their churches was on Easter, a day after his death and 2 days after he was shot, or a day and a half. That assumed incredible religious import, and the sermons that were delivered across the nation, they ranged in depth, between just absolute rage and Old Testament justice toward the South, to seeing him as a Christ-like figure, right, and kind of analogizing his death to Christ. But it was incredibly resonant for the nation, and it seemed to everybody that it had some sort of import or larger meaning. So that forever, stamped the way that people thought of him and remembered him. And it influenced a desire on the part of his original biographers and the people who were memorializing him in the days after his death to see him as a Christian figure and a devout Christian. And they did so in a way that really dramatically oversimplified and overcorrected the record. And so that's there was I think that his his assassination on Good Friday in many ways was the first moment that people began to think about what his religious sort of outlook had been.
Joshua Zeitz, author of Lincoln's God, How Faith Transformed a President and a Nation. Thank you very much for a very informative conversation.
Thank you. Really appreciate the opportunity.